Now, let me just remind you that the Cardian trade theory focuses on differences in productivity, and it thinks of production as being effectively about using labour to produce the goods. And so differences in productivity effectively reflect differences in labour productivity. And what we saw last week was that, obviously, just starting with the basic example of two countries and two goods, was that even though one country could be worse at producing each of the two goods, the food and the cloth, in the sense that they would take more time, they would take more hours or more workers to produce each unit of those two goods, it would still make sense to specialise into the good in which you have a lower opportunity cost. In other words, specialise in the good in which you have a comparative advantage. And so what we got is a diagram that looked like this, where you had relative supplies and demands on the horizontal axis, and the relative price of cloth, so price of cloth over the price of food on the vertical axis with trade. And what we said was that under Autarky, when the two economies are closed, there tends to be a relative price for home, which is P, the relative price for foreign, which is P asterisk, and the equilibrium price is going to end up in between when there's perfect specialization. So these guys, as you can see, they will, now the price of cloth has gone relative to food for home has gone up because PT after trade is higher than before trade. And so, of course, it makes sense to move economic activity towards the good that is now paying more. So that's why at home everyone is now producing cloth, and vice versa for foreign. Foreign now sees the relative price of cloth drop from P asterisk to PT, and of course it means that it will make sense to switch towards the production of food. Yeah, and so. And this is just showing that both countries benefit from trade, even though, as you can see, if the two countries have a comparable population, the home country has a production possibility frontier which is way lower than the foreign country. Yeah? And I was started looking at this, which is the same sort of idea, but now focusing on costs. And it should be straightforward that the reason why one country is going to be specialising in one good and the other country in the other good is because they manage to produce it at a lower cost. A lower cost is effectively going to reflect lower wages per unit of output. Yeah. And so what we're going to see here is another version of that diagram with relative wages rather than relative prices of the two goods. Yeah? So, first thing to remember is that prices affect cost. And in this case, because there's only one factor of production, marginal cost is actually the same thing as the average cost. And so, when you say that the price of the good is higher than for the other good, it must necessarily mean that that good is requiring more hours of labour than the second good. And so high prices will reflect higher labour costs. And so if we now think about home as specialising in cloth, the reason why home specialises in cloth it's because even though its wages are going to be lower, in order to reflect its lower productivity compared to foreign, the difference in wages is not going to be as big as the difference in productivity. And so this is what's captured by this inequality and then equation 13. So going slowly, home is producing cloth because it manages to produce the stuff at a lower cost compared to foreign. So what's the cost of producing cloth at home? Well, after trade, the wage is going to be WT. So the superscript is for the wage, the equilibrium wage in the home economy after trade. So needs to pay each worker a WT at home. and you need AC workers or AC hours of labour to produce 1 unit of cloth. So effectively, this number here is indeed the cost of producing 1 unit of seed. Now, for foreign, it's exactly the same thing with asterisks. Yeah? So now these guys, after trade, will be earning the national labour market a wage of W asterisk T. And you need AC asterisk workers, so this is your cost. So, as you can see, because home produces at a lower cost, then it must mean that home's relative wage, so the wage a typical worker gets at home relative to the wage that a typical foreign worker gets in the foreign country, is going to be lower than their relative productivity. In other words, as you can see, the difference, the relative wage is going to be low enough to compensate for low productivity. So I'll give you an example of this in here. This is just reiterating what I kind of said. Suppose this is kind of not too extreme. There are many, many countries like this. You have a country, the rich country, that has an average productivity in the cloth sector of 1. So 1 hour of work produces 1 hour of seed. And you have another country, so this is the poor country, and you have another country which is the rich country, foreign, in this case asterisk, that is going to produce 10 units of cloth per hour or per worker. So this country, of course, a worker in foreign is 10 times more productive, right? So if a worker in foreign were earning exactly 10 times more than in at home, then there would be no relative advantage in producing cloth for the poor country, because the price and the cost per unit of output would be exactly the same. However, if the wage that workers get in the poor country at home is less than 10%, then the home country, the poor country, will still manage to produce a unit of seed at a lower cost. So that's the key thing that applies to so many countries. It may well be that the rich countries can produce output with a higher productivity. But as long as your wages are low enough to compensate for your relatively low productivity, you would still have a comparative advantage. This is what's captured by this inequality. The rich country is 10 times more productive than we are, but our wage is less than 10% of the rich country's wages. And so per hour of work, we will still be able to produce more output at a lower cost than in the rich country. Yeah? So this is the key condition that requires, that is going to give you the possibility that even countries that are not particularly productive can still manage to produce goods and services to some extent at a lower cost after international trade. And these, after you've done this, you can, and this was one of the one of the questions from last year, you can kind of make sense of these so-called claims and misconceptions about trade. So all of this, I think, now requires very little explanation. First one, trade is beneficial only if a country is good enough to stand up to foreign competition. In other words, trade is beneficial only if you are highly productive compared to the other countries. As we saw, that's not true. As long as your low productivity is compensated by even lower relative wages, you will still be able to produce stuff at a lower cost. Yeah? Foreign competition is unfair and hurts the home country when it is based on low wages. What we're going to see in the second topic is that there is a grain of truth in the claim that not everyone in a country will directly benefit, because if, for example, I'm producing, if I'm importing goods that require basically unqualified workers, and I still have unqualified or less skilled workers at home, then those guys will typically be hurt by these imports. However, society as a whole, which is what this model of trade is focusing on, clearly benefits. As we saw, when we looked at the production possibilities frontier and difference curves and so on, home benefits because it allows the typical household, the typical person, to consume more of both goods, so more generally more of everything relative to the autarky scenario. Yeah, autarky scenario. So it's not, it's simply not true that society is going to be worse off because you're competing with guys against that have very low wages. Yeah, and so many people have this conception that it's unfair, but if you think about the perspective of the other country, then of course they are benefiting. They're benefiting in many cases a lot by being able to sell their stuff in your country. So this misconception leads to the third one: trade exploits the workers of poor countries. So you know, some of you maybe were wearing T-shirts and so on that cost a few pounds, and which the labour cost was probably just a few cents or a few p. Now, of course, ethically, it looks as if we are being exploiting them because we could afford to pay a lot more. And that's absolutely true. But as you know, there is a strong belief and a huge amount of empirical evidence that demand for stuff is negatively related to price. And so, if all of you, all of us, were willing to pay more for our T-shirts or coffee and so on, and not reduce the quantities, then that would be absolutely fine. So many of us, including myself, we go for organic or free trade coffee, right, and sugar and so on. If you're buying the same amount, then that's absolutely fine. But if you think at the national level, if you say, oh, I want to help those poor guys and I'm willing to pay double the price for a kilo of sugar and so on, but at the national level that means a big reduction in the quantity imported from the poor country, then it may well be that you end up by causing more harm than helping. That is, those people that are fortunate enough to be exporting this coffee will obviously be getting high wages. But because prices are so higher, there will be much less demand for coffee, and so many workers that would have potentially have been able to produce will no longer be able to do so. So my perspective on this stuff is very clear. There's nothing wrong with fair trade stuff, as long as you don't reduce quantities substantially. Yeah. So one needs to bear that in mind, because it's one thing to be earning a fairly decent wage. It's another thing to be on the £10,000, £50,000 wage. Many people will be acutely aware of the differences in prices of things. So yeah, they will probably go to Primark because for £50 they can buy a lot of stuff. And if they went to Fat Face, they would have buy a T-shirt and other things. So this misconception is important. Now, there's also associated with this misconception the idea that there are no that these guys are forcing these poor workers to work very long hours, and basically they're not respecting labour laws. That's, everyone agrees that that's not a good idea. It's very difficult to make sure that the law